All right, so welcome everybody. As I said, we have our faithful GNPS members, but we're getting a lot of visitors with these Zoom presentations, and that's really, really helpful. So before we get to our program tonight, I'd like to talk about a little bit about what's going to be happening here in the next month or so. Our next program on April 15th is the Ecology of Herbal Medicine. And Dara Seville has written a really wonderful book that takes a look at some very, very common native plants and looks at the uses and the cultural importance of many of these plants. And these are things, 5 or 6 plants that you'll recognize. So this kind of goes into our theme with our medicinal garden, our herbal garden, our healing garden that we have at the Silver Creek Botanical Garden, which, by the way, is the best kept secret in Silver City. So if you haven't been there, you need to get over there. We hope to have an April field trip. One of the things is, if we had great rains in November, December, January, we would have hillsides full of New Mexico poppies. But we didn't have that great of fall, winter. So we never know what we're going to see. So we're planning on something in April. So just stay tuned. Those of you who are not members, of course, if you're a member, you'll get all these updates. But if you're not a member, you can go down to gilanative@gmail.com. On Earth Day, yes, live, Goff Park, woohoo, Gila Earth Day. And the last few years anyway, we have had activities for kids of all ages come into our booth and experience native plants. And we'll also be selling the 4 or 5 titles that we have in our bookstore, online bookstore. And then Russ Kleinman will follow up in May with his penstemons, some of the most beautiful flowers in the world. Now he's the Silver City surgeon who just decided I'll retire and I'll become a botanist, and he is a fine botanist. But on May 7th, backing up a little bit, we have our Give Grandly celebration. And so you can get onto our website and see about Give Grandly. There will be a local live event at the Makers Market, and there will be also a way to give to very fine, wonderful nonprofits in our region. So take advantage of that. It really, really helps us. And I'd like to thank you for your support. If you would like to be a member, we're part of the Native Plant Society of New Mexico. So you can go to our website, gilanps.org, follow the link, choose Gila chapter, and it makes a great big difference to us. It helps us do the things that we do. And we think we do things very well. So here's our presentation by Ron Parry. We're going to stop our share, and then Ron, you can share and take it away. For those of you that want to ask a question, and please do, use the chat room. Use the chat room, ask a question, and when time is right, we will start going through some of those questions, okay? Okay, Ron, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm trying to move the little window. Maybe I can get rid of it. That's better. That way I don't have the screen partly blocked. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to talk about moths, one of my favorite subjects. It's an ongoing project which I started in 2012 after taking the Lepidoptera course at the research station in the Chiricahua Mountains. It's a 10-day course that was extremely interesting and included labs and field work and so forth. Anyway, so I'm going to give you an update, mostly pictures of moths that have been collected since I gave a presentation, whenever it was, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Time flies. So let's see, I'm trying to make this work. That's not working. I guess I need to use one of these arrows. Okay, so why study moths? Well, here's two reasons. Human knowledge should be erased from the archives of the world before we possess the last word that the gnat has to say to us. This is from Jean Fabre, famous French entomologist. And even though this was said a very long time ago, it's still as true now as it was then. We know so little about insects, partly because there are so many of them and they're so diverse, but they play an absolutely fundamental role in the ecology of all ecosystems, and without them, we wouldn't be here. Here's another thing, or another way to look at moths. The world is full of magic things, patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. So this is more of an aesthetic point of view. And if you're interested in moths and in insects, you will find many amazing, magically beautiful and strange things to wonder at. There's endless numbers of them. There's another reason, of course, these days to study insects and moths in particular, and that's what's been called the insect apocalypse. This article appeared in the New York Times Magazine some time ago, and it was originally based on a study that was done in Germany and one in Puerto Rico, which showed absolutely horrible losses of insect numbers and diversity. There's been more studies since then, and things aren't quite as horrible as those first two studies suggested, but things are not good. Insect populations worldwide are declining. Insect biodiversity worldwide is declining. The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences recently devoted an entire issue of its journal to this problem. Here's a figure from the introductory article. There's 11 articles. They're all open access if you want to read them, and many of them are quite intelligible to the layman. So these are some of the death by 1,000 cuts that are global threats to insects. So there's nitrification, that is water pollution from fertilizer. There's fire. You know, if you burn up an ecosystem, there's no more insects. Storm intensity, there's too much lightning, too much rain. Global warming, of course, droughts, deforestation, insecticides, too much agriculture, introduced species, pollution of all sorts, chemical pollution, light pollution, sound pollution, air and soil pollution, urbanization, the list goes on, unfortunately. And if you're interested in this and you want to learn more about it, here's an absolutely superb book, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse by Dave Goulson. He's a British entomologist, and this book is very readable. It's not very technical at all. It's really well written. It's engrossing. He tells a good story as well as giving you some suggestions what you might do to help stave off the insect apocalypse. It's available in paperback. So let's get down to the science here. So we're going to talk about the order Lepidoptera, which comes from the ancient Greek lepis for scale, pteron for wing. In 2011, there were 157,424 described species worldwide. It's the largest lineage of plant-feeding organisms. It's a sister group to the caddisflies or the Trichoptera. There was a large radiation about 100 million years ago at the same time that the flowering plants started to radiate, expand in numbers and species. It's one of the most studied and monographed insect orders. One of the reasons for that is that there's a large number of pest species in this order of insects, a lot of species that attack agricultural plants. The US has about currently 12,000 currently known, this is best numbers, they will change, of course, they'll probably go up, about 12,000 species of moths, but there's only 825 species of butterflies. So that gives you some idea of how many more moths there are than butterflies. And when we talk about moths, we're going to have to use Latin names because there's so many moths that very few moths have common names. So order Lepidoptera, it's the second largest order of insects after Coleoptera, although some entomologists think that the Hymenoptera, the wasps, insects, bees, and ants are larger in number because the number of parasitic wasps is unknown. There's probably 200,000 or 300,000 species of parasitic wasps in the world. That's why they think Hymenoptera is probably the biggest. There you can divide Lepidoptera into microlepidoptera, which are primitive moths. These are ones that have ancient characters in their anatomy, whose larvae are mostly internal feeders, but not always. Majority of families in here, there's the majority of structural diversity here, but there's a minority of species. And then the more familiar Macrolepidoptera, these are the advanced moths that include superfamilies Bombicoidea, Geometroidea, and Noctoidea. We're going to talk about all three of those superfamilies. And in the Macrolepidoptera, the larvae are external feeders. So the majority of species are found here, but the minority of families. So review of biological classification. So we go from domain to kingdom to phylum to class to order, which is Lepidoptera, superfamily, which ends with suffix oidea, then family, which ends with IDAE, and then subfamily INAE. Then you get to genus, species. This is all in Latin, of course. And a species is defined by a binomial, which is the genus, the species, and then the author who first identified that species. So families of Lepidoptera, there are 47 superfamilies. 75% of families are microleps, 35% of described species, 25% of families are macroleps, and there's 65% of described species. And the highest diversity of moths is in the New World tropics. So this is a complicated slide. Ignore all this stuff to the left. This is just to show these are all moth superfamilies, and these are all Microlepidoptera superfamilies, all the way down to here. And then we have Bombicoidea, Geometroidea, and Noctoidea. Those are superfamilies of Macrolepidoptera. And then all the butterflies are in these two superfamilies, Hesperioidea and Papillonoidea. So the world's butterflies are here, and then there are all these millions of moths. Butterflies are really just day-flying moths, is what it amounts to. So the life cycle of Lepidoptera you probably already are familiar with. You start with an egg, it hatches to a larva or a caterpillar. This is the longest lived form in the cycle usually, and it's an eating machine. These are all herbivores. They eat anything, either live or dead plant material of any sorts, dead vegetable matter, live timber, internal parts of woody plants. Some of the habits are quite strange. There's one caterpillar that was discovered that eats the discarded shells of tortoises, which is very unusual. So anyway, the larva, when it's full, it goes through 5 instars or 6 instars. These are the molts. It goes through 5 or 6 molts. And one of the things that's interesting is that the physical appearance of the caterpillar can change dramatically between molts. So the later molt, one of the later molts or instars may not look anything like one of the earlier instars or molts. So then the larva pupates, and it can spend anywhere from a few weeks to several years as a pupa in the case of some very slow maturing species that feed inside the hearts of trees. And then an adult emerges and the cycle starts over. So here's a good look at a caterpillar. So there's a head, there's 3 thoracic segments, the prothorax, the mesothorax, and the metathorax. And then there's 10 abdominal segments that are numbered A1 through A10. Here are the 3 pairs of true legs that are on the thorax. And then back here on A3 through A6, there are 4 pairs of legs that are called prolegs, and there's another pair back here. So there are a total of 5 pairs of prolegs. And the breathing system for caterpillars and the adults for that matter is through holes or spiracles into what are called book lungs. So these are the spiracles aligned here. And there's always hairs on caterpillars. They're called setae, technically. There's usually a little wart at the bottom before the hair emerges. And on the head here, you can see a tiny eye. Caterpillars are light sensitive, but they don't have any really good vision. And here's an adult cartoon, forewing, hindwing, abdomen, 3 pairs of thoracic legs, thorax, head, antennae, compound eye, and a proboscis. Now, entomologists don't call it a proboscis, they call it a haustellum. And this is a remarkable organ. It consists of two long segments that hook together to form a tube. And if you look closely at a proboscis, you will see a groove going down the length of it, and that's the line where the two halves are joined. Now I'm going to talk about scales. The last time I gave this talk, I didn't talk about scales. But one really should, after all, the order is named after the fact that these insects have scales. So the scales are actually incredibly remarkable. They're modified hairs. This is a scanning electron micrograph at a low magnification. So let's go up in magnification. You can see there's quite a lot of detail here. Let's go up some more. Now this is a 20 micron window here. And then let's go up even more to 5,000-fold magnification. This is 5 microns, this line. And to give you some idea, the smallest diameter human hair is about 10 microns. So this is about half the diameter of a human hair. And you can see even at this magnification, there's incredible levels of structure here still, nanostructure going down below the micron level. So these are really mysterious and interesting. And how a lepidopteran actually makes one of these scales is still something that we don't fully understand. We need to understand the genetics and the biochemistry of this process, and we don't yet. So the scales all have multiple functions as well. So they serve as insulation. They're found not only on the wings, but on the body of the moth or butterfly, and they serve as insulation. They keep it warm. They have colors, as I'm sure you've noticed. The color can be physical, that is, the structures of the scales are small enough that some of them can act like a diffraction grating. If you saw one of those when you went through high school physics, and if you know what a morpho butterfly looks like, it's a large tropical butterfly, which is a brilliant iridescent blue. That iridescent blue color of the morpho butterfly is a physical structure phenomena. It's caused by the diffraction of light. So all the blue butterflies, basically, that blue color and blue moths is due to physical structure. But a lot of the other colors, the reds, the yellows, the greens, are chemical, and the chemistry varies significantly. And in some cases, it's not really known. So one of the functions of Lepidoptera scales, based upon their coloration, is camouflage. We'll see examples of this in a little bit. Or warning coloration, what's known technically as aposematism. So if you look at a moth that is bright yellow or bright red and black, that's an indication that that organism is probably toxic. Certainly red is one of the indications in not only in insects, but in other organisms like snakes. If you've ever seen a coral snake, it has a lot of red on it. It's an indication that you don't want to mess with it. Oops, sorry, this is, okay, so another function of the scales is they're aerodynamic. That is, they improve the flow of the air over the surfaces of the wings. And another function is in pheromone production. So there's some specialized scales that are found on different parts of the wings, but sometimes on the bodies of the moth that produce pheromones that are involved in mating between the male and female. Usually it's the females that make pheromones, but sometimes males make pheromones as well. And speaking of mating, it's been known for some time that some moths have ears. Not all moths have ears. We'll talk more about this. But it was discovered around 2005 or so that for moths that do have ears, there's an acoustic component to mating. The males and the females can interact the scales on the wings with the scales on the body and produce ultra high frequency vibrations of low intensity, about 20 decibels, that are audible to the partner when they're close together, but are not audible enough at a distance to attract predators. So that's one acoustic aspect. And we'll talk about another one shortly. The scales are also involved in predator avoidance. So if you've ever picked up a moth or a butterfly, you've probably noticed that the scales come off easily on your fingers. Well, there's a reason for that, and it has to do with spiders. If a moth or a butterfly gets trapped in a spider web and the sticky strands are sticking, say, to the wings, well, the fact that the scales come off really easily may allow the moth or the butterfly to escape from the spider web. Now, there's another way in which scales are involved in predator avoidance, and this involves a longer story. So a major predator of moths is bats, because most moths are nocturnal. They fly at night. So as we mentioned, some moths have ears. All the nocturnal moths, mostly, we'll talk about an exception. There's always exceptions in moth biology. Most of the moths that have ears are able to produce ultrasonic sounds that they can signal back to the bat. So they hear a bat coming with their ears. The ears, by the way, are called, a single ear is called a tympanum, or tympana for plural. They all have a pair of ears because that way they get a directional sense from the sound that they hear. And the tympana are located in various places depending on the species of moth. They can be on the abdomen, on the legs, on the thorax. So it varies. And the structure varies to some degree, but they're basically a pit with a membrane stretched across it, and the membrane picks up the vibration. So anyway, a moth flying around at night that has ears can hear a bat coming, and it can respond in several ways. One way is it starts to fly in an erratic way to avoid the bat, or it drops to the ground. Another way that's more interesting is it sends an acoustic signal, ultrasonic signal back to the bat, saying to the bat, "I'm poisonous, don't eat me." And of course, the bat will have to learn to associate that particular ultrasonic signal with the fact that the moth is poisonous. See, it's similar to the monarch butterfly, which is poisonous. Well, a bird has to learn to associate the color pattern on a monarch with the fact that eating a monarch is going to make the bird very sick. And then the third strategy, which is really unusual and not very common, is the moth sends back an ultrasonic burst of sound to the bat at 120 decibels that completely drowns out the ultrasonic signals that the bat is using to find the moth. And then finally, there's something that was discovered just a year ago. A group of scientists decided to ask the question, well, okay, there are nocturnal moths that don't have ears. So how do they deal with bats? So they did some experiments, and what they discovered is that the moths that are nocturnal have specialized scales on their body and on their wings that absorb the ultrasonic signals that are emitted by the bat. In other words, these moths have developed what we would call stealth technology long before we ever figured out how to do that for fighter aircraft. So nature is way ahead of us as usual. So you can see the scales have an amazing variety of functions. Now, having gotten through that, we will talk about some specific moths. So let's look at family Bombicoidea, and these mostly tropical families, but we're going to talk about Saturniidae and Sphingidae. So these numbers here are for worldwide numbers. So Saturniidae, there's 169 genera worldwide, 2,349 species. Sphingidae, 206 genera, 1,463 species. Let's talk about Sphingidae. These are the hawk moths, the hornworm moths, the hummingbird moths. You've probably all seen these. Are amazing flyers. They can hover, they can fly forwards or backwards. They're mostly nocturnal, although if you were diurnal, that means they fly during the day. They have a long, narrow forewing. They have thick antennae that are sometimes swollen distally. That means at the ends. They have a long proboscis or haustellum, and they have a head that's pronounced. And there's some pictures of ones here. The larvae usually have this distinct caudal horn. That's why they're called hornworms. You've probably seen some of these in your garden if you're growing tomatoes, potatoes, or tobacco. All of these plants are attacked by sphingid larvae. So they're called tomato hornworms, potato hornworms, tobacco hornworms. They also attack sweet potatoes. The pupae are a little odd in that the haustellum is separate from the rest of the pupae. In most Lepidoptera, the haustellum or the proboscis is inside the pupal case, but here it's actually separated. So if you see a pupa that looks like that, you know you're looking at a sphingid pupa. And here's the most interesting, maybe the most interesting caterpillar in the world. This is Meroplanes triptolemus. This is tropical. We don't have it here, unfortunately. This is what it looks like from the top. If it's disturbed, it flips its head over, and the underside looks like this. And it also sways back and forth, moves its head from side to side. So it looks exactly like some kind of a small viper, and it will frighten off birds that see this. I've never seen one of these. I would love to see one, but so far I haven't been able to. And here are some other sphingid caterpillars with the horns. They often have these diagonal stripes on their body. And here is a parasitized caterpillar. One of the major enemies of caterpillars are parasitic wasps and flies, of which there are dozens and dozens of species. And those parasitic wasps and flies have a major impact on controlling the number of caterpillars in the world. So now let's look at some local sphingids. I'm trying to use photographs of species that were collected fairly recently. So these are all from my website. So I'll go through this one in detail just to show you what information is available on my website for each species. So there's the genus and the species. So this is Eumorpha acamon. There's what's called the Hodges number. This was a series of numbers as part of a catalog created by Ronald Hodges in 1983 to catalyze all the moths, to catalog all the moths in North America. It's out of date now, but it's still a useful way to keep track of moths. Here's the family. So this is the Sphingidae. Here's the wingspan, 83 millimeters. If you're metrically challenged, just remember that 25 millimeters is the equivalent of 1 inch. So this is over 3 inches across at the widest point of the wings. This is a male. You can often tell a male because they have feathery antennae, but that doesn't always work. There's nothing that always is true in all moths. There's so many moths that every rule is violated. This came from Black Canyon Campground in June 2019. The larval food plant is grape and Parthenocissus and related plants in the Vitaceae. It's a beautiful moth. This one you have seen before if you saw my old presentation, but I have to include this to show you its caterpillar. Sphinx dolly. It feeds on Juniperus depiana, alligator juniper, and other junipers. This male was about 2 inches across. You can see the sort of feathery antennae. And here's the amazing caterpillar. It looks incredibly like juniper. It's about 1.5 inches long at this inscar, and it has the horn, typical of Sphingidae. But try and find this on a juniper tree. You won't be able to, because it looks so much like juniper. What we typically do if we're looking at large shrubs and trees is we use a beat sheet, a piece of canvas with a frame around it and a club, and you beat the branches and you see what falls off. That's the way you will find this. You won't find it otherwise. And here's a really interesting sphingid. This one is a bumblebee mimic, Ameristhetus. This was collected on the Sheridan Corral Trail, and it's diurnal. I captured it with a net, and it was feeding on Monarda fistulosa, the beautiful mint plant. And you can see the wings are almost transparent, and it has coloration sort of like a bumblebee. And it's a male. See the sort of broad antennae here. So there are a bunch of moths and butterflies that have wings that have almost no scales. And the way this works is that when they emerge from the pupa, they have scales on their wings. But as soon as they start to flap their wings, those scales fall off. They've been engineered so that they will come off once the wings start to vibrate. Here's another sphingid that I found fairly recently. It feeds on cottonwoods and willows, Pachysphinx occidentalis. It's a big one, 137 millimeters across here. So it's over 5 inches across here. This is a male. You can see the feathery antennae again. It's a really beautiful moth, I think. Okay, let's go on to Saturniidae. There aren't that many here that come to lights, so most of the pictures you'll see this time, if you saw the earlier presentation, will be a repeat. But we have to talk about these because they're some of our largest and most striking moths. These are the giant silk moths. Now, the larvae here are often spiny or have hairy tubercles, and some of them look like this. If you ever see one of these, you never want to touch it. These are urticating hairs. That is, these are stinging hairs. Urtica is the Latin name for the genus for nettles. And these kinds of hairs pack a wallop. If you touch them, you will never forget it. They can cause serious medical problems, in fact. Other Saturniid caterpillars like this one are harmless. These little bumps actually don't have anything toxic about them. The pupae are short and fat, and they're big and leathery or papery. They're large moths. A few are diurnal. They have broad triangular forewings. They lack a frenulum. The frenulum is a little spine that attaches the hindwings to the forewings in microlepidoptera. And for some reason, even though these are microlepidoptera, they don't have that. Many species have an eye spot on the hindwing. You can see that here. You'll see this again later. I have a picture of it. They have short antennae, which are plumose, that is feathery in the male. They don't have a proboscis, basically, as adults. So the adults do not feed. The adults typically live only a few days, less than 7 days. They emerge from the pupa, they mate, and then they die. Head's rather small. They're spectacular moths in general. And we have some very spectacular ones. This is probably the most spectacular. Citheronia splendens, Sinoloensis. Wingspan of 110 millimeters, so it's more than 4 inches across here. This is a male, see the antennae. It feeds on cotton and on manzanita and on sumac. And it's maybe our most brightly colored Saturniid. Sphingicampa hubbardi, it's about a little over 2 inches across. It's a male, has some nice color on it. It feeds on acacia, mesquite, and Palo Verde. This one is one I saw just last year in August. Never seen it before. Anisota oscillari. It's a female from Black Hawk Canyon, and it feeds on oaks. And last year there were a large number of caterpillars of these, apparently, from reports on iNaturalist. I hadn't seen them, but unfortunately, but the caterpillars are bright red. And they're quite large. I wish I'd seen some. Here's Anthera oculea. This is one of our most spectacular Saturniids. Wingspan of 131 millimeters, so it's over 5 inches across, and it has these gorgeous eye spots. Now, when this moth is resting, the forewings cover these huge rear eye spots. And like most Saturniids, this moth, if it's sitting like on a light sheet, it's pretty sluggish. So if you come up to it and you touch it gently, it won't fly away. What will happen is it will move the forewings forward, and it will uncover these huge eye spots. And we think, biologists think that these eye spots being revealed like that are designed to frighten predators. This moth feeds on oak and on walnut, by the way. And this is a female, small antennae. And here's another very big one, Hyalopha gloveri. This is the western Cecropia moth. This is about 5 inches across. It's a male. It feeds on Ceanothus and on Manzanita. Okay, let's go on to Geometroidea. There are 3 tropical families here. These tropical ones are absolutely gorgeous. So many leps in the tropics are just unbelievable. But we're only going to talk about our native species here. This is a huge family. Worldwide, there are over 23,000 species of geometric. These are called geometers, inchworms, emeralds. They're variable in size from quite large to quite small. They're mostly nocturnal, have a triangular forewing. And one way to recognize the geometrid is that a pattern of the forewing frequently extends onto the hind wing. You can see that here. Here's the forewings. The pattern goes into the hind wings. Here's the forewing, and the pattern goes into the hind wings. And they tend to sit with the wings splayed out like this. So if you see that kind of a pattern on a moth, it's a geometric. But they don't all do that. For this one, example, this one is not doing that. But like any rule, as I say in moth biology, it's always broken by some exception. Some are green. I'll show you one later. These are called emeralds. And you can see again the lines extend from the forewing to the hind wing. They have moderately long antennae. They're frequently plumose or feathery in the males. And they're called geometrids because they're also called inchworms. So the caterpillars look like this usually. They're in a U shape. These are foliage-feeding larvae that are pests of many crops, ornamental plants, forest trees. They can defoliate entire trees when they have an outbreak. And the reason they look like this is because they don't have prolegs on A3, A4, A5. So there's a gap. And so they can't actually move forward like a typical caterpillar. So you can see that here. For example, here are the 3 pairs of thoracic legs. And then here's the A6 pair of prolegs. A3, A4, and A5 are missing here. And then there's a terminal set of prolegs. Same here. Here are the 3 thoracic pairs of legs. Here's the single proleg on A6 and then the terminal proleg. And geometric caterpillars can be really weird. Here's one that's just, this is its resting posture. It looks like a twig coming off a larger branch. You would have a terrible time trying to find this without a beat sheet. So here's some local geometries, and these are newer ones that I've seen. Here's these, unfortunately, the arrows here cover the writing. This is Tauros erectarius. It's pretty small. It's about 1 inch across. It's a female. It was collected in 2019. And here, see again how the pattern on the forewing extends into the hind wing on both sides. It's a very pretty little geometrid. Geometrids in general are quite delicate moths. They're quite fragile. If you're trying to pin them and spread them, it's easy to tear the wings or damage them. Here's Phaeorum mexicanaria. I think it's quite beautiful. It's over 2 inches across. It's a male. Note the antennae. Note how the pattern extends from the forewing into the hind wing. This has a larval food plant of pines. For most Lepidopteras, well, most moths anyway, the larval food plant is not known, unfortunately. So there's a huge amount of basic biology that we don't know. Tetrachus barnesi, this showed up last year in November. I was surprised to see something flying in early November. It's a really beautiful moth, I believe, at least to my eyes it is. It's 40 millimeters across. It's a male. Note the antennae. Again, note how the pattern on the forewing, extends into the hind wing. There's several species of Tetrachus in this area. I had to dissect this one to make sure I knew what species it was. The larval food plant for this is not known. And here's Odontoctyla obrimo. This is a small little geometrid, very fragile. It's only 19 millimeters across. This is from Saddle Rock Canyon, which turns out to be a great place to collect moths. And we don't know the larval food plant for this. Again, notice the pattern on the forewings extending into the hind wings. So if you saw that, you would say, oh, it's a geometrid. And also, geometrids tend to have long tapering, thin tapering bodies. That's characteristic as well. So the long, thin bodies. And here's another one, Cenoporpia vernata, also a male. Note the antennae. And again, note the pattern extending into the hind wings. This one has an unknown larval food plant. What a surprise. It's from the Lower San Francisco box, 33 millimeters across, so it's a good size. Beautifully colored. We have at least 5 species of Stenoporpia here in the Gila. And then here's an emerald, Dicordia consequaria. This was collected in 2021, just last year, outside my doorstep, and it feeds on roost species, Anacardiaceae. And again, the forewing pattern extending to some degree into the hindwing. Incidentally, the green color in the emeralds is not stable. We don't know what it is. Nobody's done the chemistry, unfortunately. But as these moths dry, if you pin them and let them dry out, the green color fades. So if you want to photograph them, you need to do so right away. Okay, let's go to Nocturnal. 3 families here to discuss. Notodontidae, about 3,800 species worldwide. Erybidae, a huge group, almost 25,000 species worldwide. And Noctuidae, also quite large, over 11,000 species worldwide. So this is a highly varied collection of moths. So the Notodontidae are called prominence because the adult moths have sort of a hump. You can see here and here. The adults have almost no mouth parts, so they're not able to feed. They don't live very long. They have a long triangular forewing. The male antennae are frequently plumose at the base, that is feathery at the base, but then ciliate distally. That means they're hairy at the tips. So more plumose down here and more hairy up here. And their tympanum is on the metathorax. They have crazy caterpillars. The caterpillars are more interesting in some ways than the adults. Notodontic caterpillars are missing the A10 prolegs. That is, they're missing the prolegs at the end of the caterpillar, the rear end. And for that reason, they often stick their rear end up in the air like this. And for reasons which I don't understand, they also often stick their head up. So quite often you'll see them sitting in a U-shaped posture. If you see a caterpillar that's sitting with a U shape like that, it's an notodontic. And they're quite bizarre, a lot of the caterpillars. They're really fascinating. Some of the tropical ones are unbelievably weird looking. Notodontids are not much in the way of pests, so they haven't been studied as much as some other groups. Here's a couple of local species collected recently, Gluphisia wrightii. This is a male, you could have guessed that from look at the antennae, and it has a complex wing pattern, which is hard to sort of say is extended to different species. So that's one of the characteristics of notodontids is there's not an easily recognizable wing pattern that you can look at and say, oh, that's definitely going to be a notodontid. So it makes identification a bit more difficult. This moth feeds on cottonwoods. And I had to do a dissection to be sure that it was what I say it is. Here's another one, Hyperpax orostriata, collected in, when was it collected? 2020 in the bird area. The bird area is another good place to collect moths. This is a male, as you would guess here. And the pattern's quite different from the previous one I showed you. That's what makes notodontids difficult. There's no simply easily recognizable pattern. What you can say about notodontids is that they're fairly large moths and they're very sturdy moths. They have big bodies and they're fairly furry usually. So that's about all you can say in terms of defining characteristics. Here's another one, Lithodontid gigantea. And you can see the pattern is quite different from the previous two that I showed you, but it's furry. And this is a male. This is from the Axel Canyon Preserve, and we don't know the food plant. Okay, let's go on to Erebidae. There's a big variety of things in here: underwings, tiger moths, woolly bears, tussock moths, and others. These are medium to large nocturnal moths. The mouth parts are variable. They have long triangular forewings, and the tympanum is on the metathorax. And you can see there's a lot of variation in their appearance here. This is a woolly bear caterpillar. This is a tussock moth caterpillar. The tussock moths usually have these 4 little tufts on the caterpillar. So the underwings, I'll talk about a little bit more. These are the Catocala. They have these beautiful yellow and black or red and black hind wings. Tiger moths are brilliantly colored. They often are diurnal. They fly during the daytime, but they come to lights as well. Catocala flies during the daytime also, but comes to lights. I have yet to collect a Lyman triad here. It's amazing, there are some, but I have never had one show up in a trap. So I can't say too much about the local species. So here's Catocala aholiba. It's a female, 83 millimeters across. So it's over 3 inches across. And like all Catocalas, it has these gorgeously colored red and black, or in some cases, orange and black hind wings. Now, when the moth is flying, these hind wings are visible, but when the moth lands, the forewings completely cover these hind wings. So what the moth biologists think is going on here is when the moth is flying, it's highly visible to predators like birds. They cue in on the hind wings. But then when the moth lands, these bright hind wings suddenly disappear and the bird becomes confused and the moth is able to live another day. But incidentally, these Catocala almost always feed on quercus. They almost always feed on oaks. And when they're sitting on an oak with their hind wings covered, they're very hard to see. So the camouflage works well. Here's maybe one of our most spectacular arctioines. Dishima howardi. This is 4 inches across. Like many arctioines, you'll see some more. The abdomen is bright orange with some kind of a black line going down the center. This is warning coloration or aposematism. So this insect is probably quite toxic. And so this is warning birds not to try to eat it. These aren't very common. It feeds on Asteraceae. And I've only seen 3 in 10 years or so. So if you see one, consider yourself lucky. Here's another arctioine. This one has almost transparent wings, but again, it has the orange abdomen with the black line going down it. And it's female, but I put it on a black background so you could see that the wings are not completely covered with scales. It's sort of translucent, so you can see light through the forewings and the hind wings. Perhaps this makes it less conspicuous, I'm not sure. We don't know the larval food plant. It might be oaks. Here's another arctioine, Verbia ostenta. Again, probably toxic, brilliant coloration on both the forewings and the hind wings. This was a male, and it was a little over 1 inch across from Pueblo Park Campground. Some of you know where that is, I'm sure. And here's one that was taken in the bird area. This was taken in 2020. Eudesmia arida, it's a male, 29 millimeters across. It's undoubtedly toxic. Here's an interesting twist. This is not unique to this moth. There are a bunch of them that feed on lichens. including this one. So lichens are full of toxic compounds. You probably saw Russ's talk on lichens, and I think he mentioned this. There's a variety of polyphenolic compounds and pigments and all kinds of strange aromatic compounds in lichens, and they're toxic. So my guess is that this moth, as a caterpillar, absorbs those toxic compounds and uses it for its own protection, and then also transfers those compounds into the adult, which has warning coloration to ward off birds. And then here's Bertholdia trigona. This is another arctiine, and this is the moth. It's small, 38 millimeters across. This is the one that makes the 120 decibel burst when it hears a bat flying in its vicinity. And you notice it has the orange abdomen, typical of arctiines. And this moth also feeds on lichen, so it's probably toxic as well. And then there's another group of Erebidae that are quite visible when they're flying. They're diurnal, but they're also nocturnal, so they come to lights. Drasteria is a genus that in the burrows and in the Gila has maybe 7 or 8 species. This is a female. It's about 38 millimeters across. This was from Saddle Rock Canyon in 2021 in September. And you notice this looks a bit like Catocala in the hindwing. That is, it has a yellow and black pattern that's rather similar. So when this moth is flying, I'm sure it's using the same strategy that Catocala is, because when this moth lands, like Catocala, it covers the hindwings with the forewings. So these bright orange and black patterns disappear. Now, the forewing pattern is brighter than typically in Catocala, but it probably still has some camouflage-like effect compared to the hindwing. So a bird is following the signal, and then the signal disappears when the moth lands. And this is a day flyer, like a butterfly, also has quite a lot of color on the underside. So this is the ventral side, and you can see this pattern on the hind wings is repeated on the ventral side, and there's also a quite distinct pattern on the forewings. So for butterflies and for diurnal moths, since they're flapping their wings up and down during the day, both the top and the bottom portions of the wings are visible to predators like birds. So they're signaling with the underside as well as the top side. And then here's a moth that is not very common here. This is Ascalapha odorata. It's also known as the black witch. This one does have a common name. This is a very large moth, 128 millimeters. So this is over 5 inches across from here to here. It's a female, and this showed up in the burrows last summer. This moth is well known in the tropics because it breeds in the tropics. It does not breed in the US, but it sometimes flies north of Mexico in the tropics. And last summer, maybe because of our really good monsoon, it appeared in a bunch of places in the burrows, and there were reports all over southern Arizona. It's called the black witch in the tropics because it's believed if this moth lands on the side of your house or it gets inside your house, it's very bad luck and someone in your family is going to die. Of course, hopefully that doesn't happen. I found this because some friends of mine in the burrows found one in their bathroom, and so they invited me over to collect it. I'd never seen one before. It feeds on multiple genera of Fabaceae, and it does have these gorgeous eye spots, which I assume have some deterrent effect on predators. So that's the black witch. If you ever see one, you'll not forget it. Okay, let's go to Noctuoidea, Noctuidae, cutworms, loopers, flower moths, medium to large nocturnal moths, variable mouth parts, long triangular forewing. The tympanum is on the metathorax. Here's a very famous one. This is Helicoverpa zea. This is famous because it's a horrible agricultural pest. But this picture helps illustrate one way to identify some noctuids. If you look on the forewing, there's a spot that looks like a kidney, and then there's a round spot. This is called the reniform spot, and this is called the orbicular spot. If you see those two spots on the forewing of a moth, you have a noctuid moth. Here's another example down here. In fact, it's clearer. There's the kidney-shaped spot, and there's the round spot. So if you see that on the forewing of any moth, you know you're dealing with a noctuid. But sometimes it doesn't show up, like here, here, here. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but if you see it, you know what you have. So there's a lot of economically important pests here. There's corn, this is the corn earworm, Lepidoptera that you saw on the last slide. There's the beet armyworm, the tobacco budworm, and many, many others. So we know relatively more about noctuidae than we do about other moths because so many of them are nasty agricultural pests. In general, they're big, sturdy moths with quite hairy abdomens and thoraxes, strong muscles for the wings. They're not at all fragile, generally, although there are exceptions. So Plagiomimicus ochia, or okoa, is one that is rare here, but it's quite beautiful. But here you can just barely see the kidney-shaped spot and the round spot, which will tell you it's a noctuid. This is a female, 32 millimeters across. We don't know what the larval food plant is. And then this one just showed up last year in September. This is Magusa divaricata. And once again, although you have to look closely, here's the, the kidney-shaped spot and here's the round spot. This is a fairly big moth, 35 millimeters across. This was a female, and it was found in Saddle Rock Canyon. And the larval food plant here, all I can find out is they feed on species of Rhamnaceae. I didn't get any better information, more exact information on that. And then here's another interesting one, Zygaenoidea serrata. This is a female collected in Saddle Rock Canyon. And here's an interesting variation. This is the kidney-shaped spot, and here's the round spot, but it's been ornamented sort of into lots of little spots, but in the center there's a kind of kidney-shaped spot. And then there's another spot down here, which occasionally shows up in noctuidae. When it shows up, this is called the claviform spot, but many noctuids do not show it, so you can't rely on it to identify a noctuid. The larval food plant for this interesting moth is unknown. And then here's an example of a gorgeous moth that's a noctuid that shows no trace of the kidney-shaped spot or the round spot. So there's nothing here to tell you that this is a noctuid, except that it's a big sort of sturdy moth. It's a gorgeous moth. Notice how beautiful the hind wings are. Again, I think what we have here is another mimicry of or something similar to what's going on in the catocala. So when it's flying, these wings are incredibly visible to a bird, but when it lands, it covers these hind wings with the forewings, and the forewings are not nearly so brightly colored, and so the moth sort of disappears. The larval food plant for this is grapes. And the underside, this moth flies in the daytime and at night. So as you would expect, the underside is also gorgeous, brilliant yellow. So when it's flying, both the yellow underside and the yellow hind wings on the top side will be visible. But once it lands, of course, these bright yellow undersides of the forewings and hind wings disappear, helping to confuse a bird. And then finally, Grotella tricolor. This is a small noctuid, it's only 21 millimeters. This is one of the flower moths. There's a whole group of these that you will find sitting on flower heads. The biggest group is called Shinia, but there's a smaller group in the genus Grotella. And we don't know what the larval food plant is for this. And so now we're going to talk about microlepidoptera briefly. We'll just talk about Zygaenoidea here. So these are fairly big moths. So they're not micro at all. That's why their term microlep is a misnomer. We're going to talk about Limacodidae, Megalopygidae, and Zygaenoidea. So Limacodidae are nocturnal, short, triangular, forewing. The legs are somewhat furry. They have the basal portion of the antenna are feathery. You can see that here. Megalopygidae are nocturnal, short, triangular, forewing, feathery antennae. Look at that, really feathery, and super furry legs, very furry. Look at how furry those legs are. Look how furry they are here, and look how furry the antennae are here, how feathery. And then Zygaenoidea are often day flyers. They have a slender body, they have feathery antennae, and the legs are more normal. So they don't look at all like these two families. So Limacodidae are most notorious because they have these amazing caterpillars. There's about 1,000 species worldwide. And some of them look like this. They're brightly colored and they have these amazing spines. These spines are horribly toxic and painful if you touch them. Not that you probably would think of doing so. So they're these urticating hairs, which will cause horrible burning or stinging sensation. Here's another example. And then the other thing about Limacodidae is they have some of the weirdest looking caterpillars ever. So here's one, here's another one. This is the head, I think. It might be here, I'm not even sure. And then this one, which looks sort of like a lump. And when you see one of these guys moving, you wonder how it's moving. The legs or such are underneath and they're sort of more like gliding motion for this one. I'm not sure about how this one moves. I've never seen one of these. This is a tropical species. And the adults have weird postures with their abdomen sticking up in the air or abdomen sticking down or just really, really strange. Here the forelegs, the front legs are sticking up. They're stout, fuzzy, brightly colored, and they have weird resting postures. Here's a local one, Prolimicodes trigona. It's not very big, 30 millimeters across. It's a male, antennae are somewhat feathery. It feeds on manzanita, and it was collected outside my doorstep. And here's one I finally saw. I've been waiting to see this for years. This showed up last year, Euclea incisa. It's pretty small, it's only about 1 inch across, but it's a gorgeous moth with these green patches. It's a male, you can see this from the antennae. This was in Black Hawk Canyon, and it feeds on oaks, probably. So Megalopygidae, there's more of these. There are 242 neotropical species. The palpi, which we haven't talked about, maxillary and labial, are these are sensory organs. They're reduced. Most adult moths have very simple eyes next to their compound eyes. These are called ocelli. In this family, they're not there. And many microleps have a sensory organ called the chitosomata, which is near the eyes, near the compound eyes. It's just a little round patch with hairs growing out of it. So Megalopygidae have that. But the caterpillars have horribly urticating hairs that, here's a new word for you probably, that cause erucism in humans. Erucism means really, really bad skin irritation caused by a caterpillar. So this is what megalopygid caterpillars look like. All the spines are covered with hairs, so you can't see them. So they don't look dangerous, but they actually are very dangerous. They're some of the most poisonous of all caterpillars. So we have one in Texas in the summer that's called the puss moth or the asp. It looks sort of like this. And people have been sent to the hospital by stepping on it with their bare feet, although they don't seem to bother lizards for some reason. So here's a megalopygid that's fairly common here, Megalopygia decessa. It's pretty small. This was a male. You can see that from the antennae. It feeds on oaks and manzanita. It's very furry. Most adult megalopygids are very furry. Here's another one, Lepidoptera. Again, pretty small, 30 millimeters, but not micro by any means. Very feathery antennae. It's a male. And very feathery body. And this one is quite common. You see this every summer. It feeds on acacia and on willows. Okay, and finally, Dalceridae. These are related to Lamicodidae. There's 50 neotropical species. There's only one that makes it into the US. Most typically it's known from Arizona, but we have it here in New Mexico. We have it in the Gila. That's Dalceridae ingenita. The whole moth is orange except for the eyes. The legs are orange. The antennae are orange. The wings are orange. The body's orange. You can't mistake it for anything else. And you'll see it at a light sheet. But the most interesting thing about Dalceridae are the larvae. Unfortunately, I have never seen them. Here's what the larvae look like. They're covered with this gelatinous material that almost looks like glass. Our species looks basically like this. This is a tropical species, this is a tropical species, and this is tropical. Now this gelatinous material is secreted by the setae, the hairs. They're on the surface of the caterpillar, and it's gooey. So any parasitic wasp or fly that tries to lay an egg on this is going to get all gummed up. Any bird that tries to eat it is going to get all gummed up. And if this material is peeled off, let's say by a bird trying to get at the caterpillar can reproduce it. It can secrete more of it. I'm not sure what it's made of. I would guess it's some kind of polysaccharide, but it really looks like glass more than anything else. It looks like some kind of fantastic sculpture. And here's our local species, Dalceridae ingenita. As I say, everything about this except the eyes is orange. It's pretty small, but it's unmistakable if you see it. The caterpillar feeds on manzanita and on emery oak and on another oak species. So I keep searching emery oak, hoping to find one of these caterpillars, but I have not succeeded yet. Hopefully someday. And that's about it, except for Zygaenoidea. These are also really interesting. The larvae are very colorful. These are poisonous. They have alkaloids in them and they emit hydrogen cyanide. Both the caterpillars emit hydrogen cyanide and the adults. There's a lot of species, over 1,000 described worldwide. We have 25 in the US. And here's one that's an agricultural pest, the grape skeletonizer, Ericina americana. The adult looks like this. It looks more like, almost like an arctiine. And here's the caterpillars. They're brightly colored, presumably to indicate to predators that they're toxic. And here's our most common species, Neolibris fusca. See, it looks like an arctiine. It has the orange abdomen with a black line or black coloration going down the length of the abdomen. And it is toxic because it emits cyanide. It's diurnal, but it does come to lights. It's pretty small, 26 millimeters, but it's fairly common. This was a male, as you can see. And that brings me almost to the end. Brief note of web resources. Here's my website. If you click on this link, you'll get to a page that looks like this. There's 20 photos per page. You've been looking at photos all through this talk. If you click on one of the photos, you'll get an enlarged version, which gives you all the information you want. I'm now up to roughly 740 photos on my website. So we've come a long way since 2012. And then there's the Moth Photographers Group, which it covers moths for the entirety of North America. So it's a huge website. It can be a little intimidating because it is so huge, but there's a lot of useful information on there. So I highly recommend this website. And finally, I just want to thank Dr. John Brown, who was formerly of the Systematic Entomology Laboratory at the USDA National Museum of Natural History, Washington, DC, for allowing me to use some of his slides. And thanks so much for coming to my talk. I'm all done. And I'm trying to get back to the main screen here. There we go. So I can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay, I tried to unmute and I thought I was. Anyway, the take home for me is just that there are so many thousands and thousands of species of moths. And that's part of our native biodiversity. And we
Absolutely.
don't know the roles that they play. We don't know all of
Absolutely.
the host plants. And I'm assuming that they evolved with our native plants.
Yes, they do. Absolutely. So they play a huge role in the ecology of our native vegetation because they're major herbivores.
So one of the efforts that we are undertaking is to provide people with host plants, plants that moths and butterflies will lay their eggs upon, the caterpillars will feed on them, our bird species will feed on those, so this whole food chain, and it's just amazing. So some will be interested.
One of the reasons why it's important to plant native plants.
Yes,
because our local species won't lay their eggs on non-native plants.
Yes, and that's kind of a hard sell for us with people that have non-native plants planted, and to try to convince folks that if you're interested in biodiversity, that native plants, it really is the way to go. But just also the fact that they're here and they grow on our non-soil, and they're used to our temperaments of drought and no rain. Someone was very, I think, probably excited. Many of us are excited there will not be a final quiz here. But a question here, you lose cells by your escaping predation. Does that affect the moth's ability to fly? And do they make new scales?
Oh, no, they do not. The adults are not able to replace scales. That's one of the things that, why as they get older, if you collect moths, you soon learn to recognize a moth that's been around for a while, because the abdomen and the wings will be missing lots of scales.
Good. So there's just a comment by Jeff Boyd about hornworms and Datura, and that's that Solanaceae, that family Solanaceae link there with the moths. How do moths deal with rain?
Well, they're surprisingly good at it. One of the things that I guess should have been on my list of properties of Lepidoptera scales is that the scales are water repellent. So they won't generally fly in a downpour, but a light rain doesn't seem to faze them at all. And if you see a moth come to a sheet when it's been raining lightly, you will see the water beaded up on the surface of the body and the surface of the wing. So the scales are water repellent.
Excellent. So what native plants are food for the most species of moth larvae, based on what we know today?
Probably oaks.
Yes.
I don't know why that is. It's interesting because oaks are full of toxic compounds, all kinds of tannins, polyphenolics. They're loaded with things that are toxic, and you would think would deter insects from feeding on them, but they are a very common food plant for moths.
And I noticed in your talk that there seems to be a lot of moths that utilize the manzanita, which was kind of interesting.
It is unusual, right? But you have to remember, of course, that for most moth species, we don't know the food plant.
Right, and so
we don't know very.
I
don't
think
have a good data set.
One of the things that Margie Gibson was probably getting at is the value of grasses, native grasses, for these moth species as host plants. Can you tell us anything about?
Yes. So a lot of microleps use grasses more than macroleps. In fact, there's a group of moths called crambas that are microlepidoptera, and this group has within it a group called the grass crambas, because all of the moths in that group lay their eggs on grasses. They're small moths, they're slender little moths. You won't even notice them unless you're looking for them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to where there's a patch of grass and you have a net, a butterfly net, toward the evening, if you sweep your butterfly net through the grasses, you will pick up some grass crambas.
So I was wondering during your talk, I was thinking about I would love as a one of our field trips is to go out and do some netting, some light trapping, and at least at some level, for us beginners in moths, would you be willing to do something like that with us?
Sure. And another thing we could do, I volunteer with a group from the University of Nevada, Reno, that is studying caterpillars. So last fall, they were here, and we went up Little Cherry Creek Road, which is usually, there's lots of water and lots of vegetation. And the group all had beat sheets, and you'd be amazed at the number of caterpillars of all sorts that landed up on the beat sheets. So they were collecting, but we could always do that sometime and then put the caterpillar back on the plant that we got it from. Or if you want to try and raise the caterpillar to the adult, that's a fascinating exercise. But you have to be continually providing the caterpillar with fresh plant material every few days. And you have to be cleaning out the container that the caterpillar is in and is feeding, because of what we call caterpillar frass. That's caterpillar poop. You have to get rid of it because that can make the caterpillar sick or attract parasites. But we know even less about the caterpillars than we know about the adults.
All right, so we're going to work on a field trip. So Chris Jepson is wondering, the Berthoidea, they generate 120 decibels. That is a lot of energy, she says. How do they do that?
It is. Well, they have, that particular moth has something that looks like a comb-like structure embedded on the abdomen, and then it has a spine on the wing, and it's able to move that spine back and forth across those teeth of the comb exceedingly rapidly. It's pretty amazing.
Yes. So Andy wants to know if moths can see each other's colors in the dark.
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. A lot of colors don't show up well in the dark, of course.
So Chris Jepson also, I think with the Southwestern New Mexico Seed Library, has increased stock of seeds of native plants to grow natives, and has a goal to continue in that endeavor, open to more ideas. And this idea of these seed libraries, and I have 10,000 projects that I'd love to do with Gila Native Plant Society, and we'll get to some of those soon. But at the Commons, there is the largest library that we have right here. But if we could get more and more people collecting native seeds that we could plant that could act as larval host plants for these moths and butterflies, that would be wonderful.
You could certainly monitor caterpillars that show up in the garden that's been created.
Mm-hmm. So Robin Austin, have you read any studies on light pollution's impact on moths? Is it better to leave porch lights off when possible?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. So this is a matter of increasing concern. It's not just moths, it's all insects. There's a lot of insects out at night besides moths, and urban light pollution and light pollution in general interferes with navigation in insects that are flying at night. And because they use stars and they use the moon, and human lights are very distracting. So there have been a bunch of papers addressing light pollution. Another problem in big cities is that the moths get attracted, to say a high rise or whatever, a big commercial building, business tower or whatever, and they get lost and they don't find their way out of there. So yes, the effects are bad.
All right. Well, let's just do one more question here. This might be a tough one. Why do male moths have these feathery plumose antennae while the females do not?
Oh, that's a very easy question to answer. It's
Great.
because the females are generally the moths that secrete pheromones. And the males are detecting pheromones using their feathery antennae. So they're flying detecting, from kilometer away or maybe 1,000 feet. We don't really know how far away the range is, but there have been studies that show that those feathery antennae on the moths can detect just a half dozen molecules of pheromone, and then they can follow that concentration as it increases upstream to the female and locate the female.
Yeah, that's excellent. So oftentimes these why questions are difficult to answer, but it makes sense. They're large pheromone collectors in the males.
That's it.
All right, well, that is it. So it's 8:22. So let's pull the plug on this one. That was absolutely excellent, Ron. And let's put all your little Facebook or Zoom happy clappy hands together. And thank you, Ron. And I will be in contact with you because we have a lot of questions. We're doing some stuff with Gila Native Plant Society on these plant hosts. And so there's more information that we're going to need to glean from you, and also some kind of field trip that might be conducive to families where mom and dad, kids can learn more about moths. And so anyway, exciting times ahead.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Adios.
Good night.
Ciao.
Even to Isla, goodbye.
Hey there, Ron.
Thanks, Ron.
That was fun.
Yeah, great presentation.
It was. You guys all take care.
You too.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.